The 1960s and protest culture. Civil rights movements began when 4 black students held a sit-in at a white lunch counter in 1960. After the bill was passed that banned segregation on public buses, civil rights activists organized a through-state bus rides called Freedom Rides in which they tested this ruling. In Binghamton, Alabama, angry KKK members attacked and burned a bus. This caused the ICC to enforce integration on transportation. In the 1960s, students began movements for change in the segregated South by participating in sit-ins, protests, and marches, and boycotts. Here is an example of the sit-in at the lunch counter, and here is the example of the burning of the bus. 1963 was the most eventful year for civil rights. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King Jr., led a large march to end segregation in Alabama. He was ultimately jailed, and the protest received publicity because it showed white cops hurting young protesters. This led to desegregation of public accommodations in Alabama. The most radical form of violence on protesters was in 1965, when protesters were attacked with tear gas and batons by white police when they were attempting to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. This prompted President Lyndon B. Johnson to present the Voting Rights Act, which abolished voting discrimination in elections. Both the pictures on the bottom depict the violent protesters in 1965, which was called Bloody Sunday. Both presidential candidates, Nixon and Kennedy, captivated the country by promising to restart the economy after one of the worst depressions. The publicly televised debate showcased that Kennedy was a more promising candidate, where Nixon appeared sweaty and uncomfortable, as in this picture here. Kennedy was elected in 1961 after winning by 1% and launched the U.S. into foreign affairs, which changed America's opinion on these international affairs. Kennedy was in support of a civil rights bill but received pushback from the South, and the bill ultimately stalled in Congress. In 1959, Fidel Castro and his army overtook Cuba and instituted leftist policies on agrarian reforms, land redistribution, and nationalizing private organizations. In 1960, the U.S. organized a trade embargo to isolate the Cuban regime. In 1961, the countries broke diplomatic relations. On April 16, 1961, an invasion of mostly Cuban emigres landed on Giron Beach at the Bay of Pigs. Cubans overtook the outlaws and took many prisoners. Cubans' success in stopping this invasion showed the legitimacy of the new regime and embarrassed the U.S. Here is the Bay of Pigs, and here is a picture that shows the prisoners. Cuba began to go closer with the Soviet Union as relations with the U.S. dwindled. In 1962, the Soviets deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba. When America was informed, everyone watched in horror as the nations were on the brink of a nuclear war. This was resolved when the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles if the U.S. agreed to remove our missiles from Turkey and gave a formal statement that we were not to invade Cuba. In 1966, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Cuban Adjustment Act, which allowed Cuban refugees to become presidents. Here is an image of the missiles in Cuba. Find the highest power. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and Vice President Johnson overtook, but lacked the president's youthful charm and charisma. Johnson embraced the civil rights movement and navigated Kennedy's stalled bill through Congress and signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination and segregation in public accommodation. The United States was terribly afraid of communism taking over the world. In 1954, the Geneva Peace Conference temporarily split Vietnam into 2 states, Communist North Vietnam and U.S.-run Democratic South Vietnam. When reports of fire from North Vietnamese ships in the Gulf of Tonkin were received, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted Johnson the authority to deploy the American military to defend South Vietnam, as shown in this picture. In March 1965, the ground war began. Military leaders knew that we were not going to win, and the war resulted in over 20,000 American soldiers killed. Rebellion rocked the nation, and youth counterculture became mainstream. Advertisers looked to this growing counterculture to market their products. The 1960s promoted individuality and rebellion. Culture was also changing rapidly as clothing became less restrictive, such as capri pants and miniskirts. In 1960s, also launched the remedy of psychedelic drugs. Young middle-class white people began using LSD, which took society out of its stagnant life that it had become. Woodstock music festivals became an outlet for young youths to escape reality and embrace protest culture. This is a picture of Woodstock and this is a poster. Rock and roll music overtook teens as it showcased the new liberated society. It embraced sex, diversity, and drugs. From the 1950s to 60s, everything flipped from music to sexuality to drugs and diversity. It was a new liberated society. This is a video from popular band Country Joe and the Fish that performed at Woodstock during this time.
1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die.
Malcolm X emerged as he advocated armed resistance for the rights of Black Americans. In 1966, Huey Newton and Bobby Saleh formed the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. They used decolonization to take power away from whites. Women were active in civil and labor movements. Change was necessary in areas of employment, taxes, income, labor laws, and services. Women also fought for welfare benefits. The Women's Strike of Equality focused on employee discrimination, political equality, abortion, free childcare, and marriage equality. The end.